Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And it's good to see you all here today. So, well, we've been studying, working with, trying to practice the Eightfold Path. And last week we talked about right view. The second element in the Eightfold Path, keeping in mind that these are not sequential ways or sequential points along the way. They're more interconnected practices, all 8 of them, that nourish one another. But the second one is sama sankapo. And sama is usually translated as right. But we discussed how that gives it doesn't have quite the right tone. And other translations, such as appropriate or skillful or balanced, may be better, or at least complement the translation so it's better understood. It's not a sort of a right and wrong thing. It's more about what is skillful, what works, what is appropriate for the occasion. Sankalpa is often translated as thought or intention. It can be translated as resolve or purpose. It has to do with not only any thought that arises in the mind, but only those that are given consideration and are intentional thought. So there is a definition for right resolve or right intention. And it's short and sweet. What is right resolve? Being resolved on renunciation, on freedom from ill will, on harmlessness. This is called right resolve. Those 3 things: renunciation, not bearing ill will, and not causing harm. Renunciation of what? Well, in the suttas, renunciation refers to sensuality. Renunciation of sensuality, which is, I think, a point of potential confusion, because we're sensual beings. We have contact with things, and some things give rise to pleasure, other things give rise to pain, and further other things give rise to neither pleasure nor pain. Some things are pleasant, some things are unpleasant inherently. What are we going to do about that? I think what's meant by renunciation is not chasing after the pleasant. So, renunciation of attachment to pleasure. And the Buddha, in another sutta, goes into this in somewhat greater depth. And this is a well-known sutta about dividing one's thoughts into 2 sorts. It's a little longer, but I'll read it. The Blessed One said, referring to the Buddha, monks, before my self-awakening, when I was still just an unawakened bodhisattva, the thought occurred to me, why don't I keep dividing my thinking into two sorts? So I made thinking imbued with sensuality, thinking imbued with ill will, and thinking imbued with harmfulness, one sort, and then thinking imbued with renunciation, thinking imbued with non-ill will, and thinking imbued with harmlessness, another sort. And as I remained thus heedful, ardent, and resolute, thinking imbued with sensuality arose in me. I discerned that thinking imbued with sensuality has arisen in me, and that leads to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both. It obstructs discernment, promotes vexation, and does not lead to unbinding. As I noticed that it leads to my own affliction, it subsided. As I noticed that it leads to the affliction of others, to the affliction of both, it obstructs discernment, promotes vexation, and does not lead to unbinding, it subsided. Whenever thinking imbued with sensuality had arisen, I simply abandoned it, destroyed it, dispelled it, wiped it out of existence. And as I remained thus heedful, ardent, and resolute, thinking imbued with ill will arose in me. I discerned that thinking imbued with ill will has arisen, and that leads to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both. It obstructs discernment, promotes vexation, and does not lead to unbinding. As I noticed that it leads to my own affliction, it subsided. As I noticed that it leads to the affliction of others, to the affliction of both, it obstructs discernment, promotes vexation, and does not lead to unbinding, it subsided. Whenever thinking imbued with ill will had arisen, I simply abandoned it, destroyed it, dispelled it, wiped it out of existence. But it sounds like that kind of thinking subsided more or less on its own once it was identified as such, as being a cause of affliction and a cause of vexation. So a couple things about this. It sounds straightforward, but you know that it always, as with so many things, becomes more complicated in its application. Another thing about it is that it sounds a little negative, like avoid sensuality, avoid ill will, avoid doing harm, avoid, avoid, avoid. Which leaves open, well, what do you do once you've avoided those things? What's positive? I mean, in usual instruction, if you're in charge of, say, teaching or leading a group of youngsters, is don't give negative commands. Don't say, don't run. Say, walk, or walk slowly, or don't say, quit yelling. Speak softly. So give a positive command. It's much easier. And the same thing applies to training a dog. Just saying no, don't do that is not effective as a command. So it would be nice to have some positive aspects to keep in mind when assessing thoughts or impulses, when aligning intentions. And of course, the suttas do provide plenty of those. One example would be the teaching of the Brahma Vihara. The divine abode, as it's usually translated, which includes 4 elements: kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. The Buddha recommends that we make our home there, amidst kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, taking pleasure in the good fortune of others, and equanimity. And these things can serve as antidotes, in a way, to pesky desire for sensuality or ill will or impulses to do harm. So this is, one summation of what is intended by this second element of the Eightfold Path. So some of you may know I've been volunteering to drive a truck for the food pantry here in the Rittner School District. And it's been, I've enjoyed it. But one aspect of it is riding around for 6 hours in a truck, going from store to store, picking up things with individuals who usually have a quite a bit different background than I've had. It gets me out of my bubble in a way. And I was with one such person a couple weeks ago. And we were talking, and we talked about movies, and he's the sort of person who enjoys movies that show at the Esquire. I guess I tend to be, enjoy movies shown at the High Point. So we didn't have a lot in common there, but it was interesting to hear his enthusiasm about some of these movies that I've never seen. But it came out in conversation, during 6 hours, a lot comes out, that he's involved with the Knights of Columbus. And I was curious about that. There's a Knights of Columbus facility just within walking distance of our house here. And well, I knew that it was some kind of charitable organization, but I wondered what they did exactly. And so I asked him to tell me more about the Knights of Columbus. He's been a member for many decades. And he mentioned among their charitable activities currently, they're providing housing for refugees from the Ukraine. There's a facility in Poland where they're developing housing and also providing other resources, food and clothing, etc., for at least some of the huge number of refugees that are affected by the war. And also, he mentioned in Latin America, they are providing, for instance, in Haiti, They have charitable work that they do, providing food, shelter, medicines, the needs of the people there in that troubled country. And on the state side, they also have activities. And he mentioned we've provided 1,000 ultrasound machines to pregnancy centers. Well, I knew he was referring to centers like Birthright, where they basically see women in early pregnancy and encourage them to exercise some other alternative to abortion. And he said that 80% of people who have ultrasounds choose to continue their pregnancy. And I don't know where he got that statistic. It's actually on the Knights of Columbus website, unreferenced. But in any case, when he said this, it sparked a thought in my mind. It sparked the thought, oh, he's one of them. Because I've had interactions with people regarding the topic of abortion for many, many years. And when that came up, there was this impulse to sort of assign him to a category and sort of either start, a conversation that could turn into an argument, or just be a little bit more distant from this person. But it occurred to me that there wasn't really any use in that I really like this guy. He's good-hearted, and I really kind of loved him, and I just didn't want to give that up just because we wouldn't, I'm sure, agree on this one issue. So I just let it go, and we went on with the conversation, and it took other paths. Because over the years, I've grown weary of arguing about abortion. I find that people's position tends to be fairly fixed. And it's unlikely that at least I will be successful in persuading anybody. It occurs to me that would I have acted the same way if he said something hateful or disparaging about Blacks or Jews or Latinos? I hope not. I hope I would have raised my voice under those circumstances. But it brings up the complexity sometimes of this right intention, right resolve. And I've come to understand more the position of those opposed to abortion. That inherently it's kind of a tragic situation. It's a tragic procedure. Earlier in my training, I spent 2 half-days a week performing abortions for a couple of years. And I was aware of hearing the stories, aware of the tragedy of the whole thing. And I would sometimes get headaches during those half-days, peculiar pain behind one eye or another, a kind of headache that I really haven't had at any other time. I don't quite understand that, but I have persisted in my opinion that if there is a tragic choice to be made, the moral agent who will most feel the consequences should be the one to make the choice. And that I cannot equate, in my mind, the moral agency of a so many week fetus with that of a competent reproductive age woman. And also the notion of finding abortions objectionable is entirely different to me than the notion of recruiting the power of the state to enforce one's views about abortion. But I don't want to turn this into a conversation about abortion, but I use it as an example of things that come up in the mind, and how they can and should be reflected upon, and how the Buddha guides us to reflect upon them in such a way that we choose that which is most likely to be of greater benefit for ourselves and others in the long term, that which is least likely to cause suffering for ourselves and others in the long term. And I would say that which is least likely to disrupt relationships in the long term. So sama sankapo, right intention. I would be interested in your thoughts about what that means to you, what it means to avoid chasing sensuality, what it means to avoid harboring ill will, what it means to avoid doing harm. Sounds simple, not always easy in practice, like so many things. Maybe you can think of examples in your own experience to illustrate the points. So we'll stop there and break up into groups. And then reconvene in a few minutes. I did want to mention, while everyone is here, that next week we are having a guest speaker, and we'll take a little respite from the Eightfold Path. It's kind of intense talking about it. We'll take a respite and take refuge with our guest speaker, Sustama, who will be talking about refuge from the standpoint of psychology and Pure Land Buddhism. So I hope you can all be here for that. She has spoken with our group before, and it is always delightful to hear from. So join us next week, please. So we'll break up into groups now. Thank you for listening.